Hello, I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer. I'm continuing with my look at the field systems in Old England. Now this is I can't remember whether this is the third in the line of these little talks in which I'm trying to learn the history of the field systems which led to the villages that we know of today, that came around sometime between 900 and 1200 AD. And I suppose looking at the reason why there's a misconception that the villages started much earlier, although there were settlements and clusters of buildings that we could call villages. So I've been working from this book by Christopher Taylor, who was a leading field archaeologist in the 1970s, and he wrote a number of books. This one's Fields in the English Landscape. And so this is the third of my talks, and the reason I do this, and I've mentioned this before in all of them, but of course I'm always aware that people are watching this for the very first time. They may come across this because of the keywords and things like that, and this is the first time they've ever come across the Bald Explorer and all of that, which is why I always introduce who I am and what I'm doing. And I have made some notes about this. The reason I'm doing this is because I find the best way to learn is actually to read, make notes, and then share that. So by me having to regurgitate what I've learnt helps me get into my head those things I want to know. So forgive me if I make mistakes. I'm not a historian, I'm not an archaeologist. I'm just an enthusiast who's very keen to learn, and in the videos that I do where I'm walking around the countryside, I'm trying to put in more of the information so that when I walk around I can spot things and share them with you. So that's really the whole point of this. And as the first couple of these have gone down reasonably well and people have asked me to continue, I thought I am. So we're looking at the Saxon fields this time. We looked at the Neolithic farmers and how they started to cultivate the land and clear the forests and the woodland. And then we looked at how the Romans came in and discovered that actually they didn't need to do a huge amount themselves other than just take over. And then they were here, of course, for some time with all their innovations and their road systems and a whole load of improvements that they made. But at some point around, is it 450, 460 AD, the Romans found that they were needed back in Rome because their civilization, or their empire I suppose, was collapsing. And because of that there was a bit of an exodus, and many of the Romano-British were suddenly left on their own. Their statesmen and their police force, their governments were disappearing, and they were left on their own. And at this time as well, and just before, England, such as it was, or the Britain, the island, was being invaded or raided, perhaps is initially, by these Scandinavian people, the Saxons and the Angles and the Vikings and all of that were coming over. And initially, I suppose, seeing what resistance was here, what we had, what they would like, and what land that they could eventually come and settle on. And I guess these raids were coming in, stuff were taken, and they would go back and report. And over decades, this idea that it would be quite nice to come and migrate over here and have some of what we've got started to become a plan. And so the Saxons came. Now, this is really just looking at the field systems. There's the whole business about the Saxon, the kingdoms, the lords of the manor, feudalism and all of that, which I can't cover in this at all. We're just looking really at the landscape. So Christopher Taylor talks about the Saxon fields being hard to explain and also hard to find actual evidence of Saxon. Now, people always think of the Saxons as being these open fields with the strips, and we'll come on to that. The misconception is that these open fields came when the Saxons first arrived, and actually that's now been thought to be completely wrong, and that the open fields came much, much later, sort of 400 odd years later, or back in the 900 period, just before the Normans came. This was already up and running, but not until that later period. So by the end of the Roman period, England, as Christopher Taylor says, looking at my notes here, was exceptionally well populated and intensively farmed. So when the Saxon raiders came, they found that actually the landscape, just like when the Romans came, most of the woodland had been cultivated, that there was this wonderful potential for them if they could just subdue the existing people who were there. So they arrived as raiders, and they probably did chase people off land, kill people, and take over their landscape. And they probably also at the same time, you've got to remember, of course, there were far more Romano-British on the land than the raiders. I mean, the raiders came in and there were loads of us. There was, I mean, estimates are about, I don't know now, 3 million, 3 to 4 million people in the country at the end of the Roman period. So the Anglo-Saxons coming in would have been overwhelmed, but the Romano-British their armies had gone, and so they weren't used to fighting because the Romans did all that, protected the land. They were unprotected, and so I guess it was a relatively easy thing for the Anglo-Saxons over a period of time. It didn't all sort of happen in one afternoon. I mean, it took decades and even a century really, and then they came in the southeast, and then they progressed westwards and northwards, and there were still areas at the end of the sort of 1st century or 2nd century, or even before the Normans came in, that were still not really under Anglo-Saxon control. So you can see it took a very long time. But the Saxons themselves were farmers, and interestingly, if you look at apparently, I mean, I'm saying this as if I know, but apparently, according to Christopher Taylor, that if you were to look on the continent at the same sort of time and to see what the Saxons themselves, how they farmed and how their landscape looked, they were farming in pretty much the same fashion than the English were doing then. And that was small fields, small rectangular fields, not these large open fields that we have wrongly thought that the Saxons were doing. This came, as I say, a little bit later. So it was a drawn out process. So pretty much when the Saxons came and they started to take over the farmsteads and all of that, it continued pretty much in the same sort of traditional way that had been farmed before. So what about the Roman villas themselves that had been, I suppose, the big country mansions that we have today, and the big landowners and all of that? Well, it would appear that the Anglo-Saxons weren't terribly interested in taking over the property. I mean, some of them may well have done, but it seems that they had their own traditional ways of doing things, and they probably let the people in the villas continue until they died out really over time, and eventually the villas themselves started to fall to bits and were just abandoned. And much more is this sort of amalgamation of the two types of people, the Anglo-Saxons and the Romano-British, over time would have just become a one people, as we see in history. They are just amalgamated. So that's all interesting. what is also interesting is that the boundaries, the parish boundaries that we see in the medieval period, which we think must have been set up by the Anglo-Saxons, the parish boundaries, was actually more likely to have been set up in the Roman times than actually by the Saxons themselves. They probably just continued these boundaries. So I find that quite fascinating. It's often been assumed that the current villages that we see, and this is really what got me going on this whole investigation, were arranged, the sort of villages that were arranged all along a long road, and you see all the houses all along one road, or the village green where the houses are all around the green. It's always been a sort of myth, really, that the Saxons brought that in, or that the villages grew up from the settlements that the Saxons had. It's more likely that, again, the Romans, who had the main infrastructure of their road systems, that much more of these villages came from where the Romans had a cluster of villas and things, and later that the village's layout, which changed in around 900, came about. So it wasn't so many, and it's also, sorry, I'm not being very clear here, but some of the villages, there seemed to be a decision to change how this traditional pattern from the Neolithics, then the Romans, and then the initial Anglo-Saxons came with all these sort of remote farms abutting each other, changed, and something was happening that meant they needed to reorganise and restructure the way people lived and the way that they farmed and the way that the farm land was delegated to everybody. And so this is really where we start now, after the Anglo-Saxons had been here for some time and had conquered and people had assimilated together. Population was growing. And this is the thing that made it very important that they got a little bit more organised, because land became scarce, and land, of course, was how they were feeding themselves. So there was this primitive way of farming initially that a lot of other countries had been doing, and this infield outfield system. So you would have an area of land which you would turn into small fields, and you would farm quite intensively until the soil gave up. You've got to a point now where all the woods have been cultivated and pretty much the land is all cultivated. But there are areas which are not cultivated but are not necessarily woodland. So you would have this sort of infield where all of this is going to be worked, all these little fields, and all these people had it for a while. And then after 3, 4, 5 years, they would go, there's no goodness in the soil left. So you would then turn to this other area of fields and you would farm that, leaving these to recover. So you would have this sort of in-out system. We're doing this for the next 5 years and we're going to abandon this. This is my understanding from Christopher Taylor. Well, it would seem that as the population grew, you got to this point where you've got this abandoned stuff and you've got this more cultivated stuff, and this sharing of this switching backwards and forwards over years. But it would seem that there came a point, and this is quite complicated to explain because this is where you've got lords of the manor making decisions and the feudal system happening and all of this, which I'm not going into in this. But at some point, because the population was growing, it seemed that they had to put all of this fields under some form of better structure. And in order to appease everybody in the community, you needed to be able to give all the individual farmers a section of the good stuff and the bad stuff. And I think that's when the open field system starts to come in, and that you would find that the farmers or the individuals would have a strip here and then a strip over here and a strip over there, and you'd have the three-field system, which we'll talk about in more detail in another video, so that they would all have a little bit. And of course you had the churches that were being built up with their rights to have a certain amount of land, and of course the lords of the manor who would have their certain amount of land, of which the serfs would have to work on as well as their own. But we're getting now into a system which is a lot more complex and harder to understand, and I need to do my research on that. And also you've got the lords of the manor and how these communities then with this bigger field systems were setting up, which changed how the individual farmsteads would operate. So that now, using some of the road structure that had been laid down a lot by the Romans, but not all, would now demand, and this change of land use would demand that the houses would, instead of being all over the place because they would be in the way, that they were all moved into more of these villages and then larger villages, which were towns. So that's the point, around 900, well, between 900 and 1200, as we move away from true Anglo-Saxon invaders and farmers into a completely different system, and then the Normans coming in, who pretty much just became the new administrators and adopted the same system, and of course then you've got, you know, all the kings and queens who were making their rules. So that's pretty much it. But we do know a little bit more about the, just turning to my notes, a little bit more about the Saxons, the sort of things that they were growing. What were they growing? Well, they were growing wheat and barley, oats, flax, hemp in some parts of the country, rye and beans. And that sort of suggests the legumes that started to understand how you could put nitrogen, although they wouldn't have called it that presumably, back into the soil, and so you could regenerate the soil better. They had sheep, cattle, pigs and even goats at that point. We still don't 100% know in the early days what difference they had in terms of ploughing, but we know that the Romans had brought in the heavy plough with the share and the mouldboard and the coulter, and that had improved things. So there's no reason to doubt that they weren't using all of that technology and probably improving it and working out better systems. But really, as we get towards 900, that's when these new things change and the landscape starts to change a little more dramatically. And when I next have done my research, I'll bring all of that to you. So I hope that's been of interest, and even if it sounds a bit confusing, it might lead those of you who want to know more to go and investigate for yourselves. It certainly is slowly getting into my head, and when I walk around the countryside, I try now to visualize a bit more of all of this landscape through the different time periods as I have learnt it. Anyway, there you go. Thought I'd share what I'm trying to learn with you. I hope it's made sense. If you've enjoyed the videos that I make, do give me a thumbs up. Don't forget to follow, like and subscribe. It really helps. And if you become a patron, of course, it keeps me going. Thanks again. Take care, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.